Good day and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Businessmap and Agenda Shift. My name is Saubena and I'm going to be guiding you through the session today. My colleague Nora will be handling the Q&A and the chat, so feel free to send in your questions as we go along. Before we dive in, just a quick note about the logistics. We have set aside 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. However, we're going to keep the format a bit more interactive, so please submit your questions using the Q&A section as Nora advised earlier. And if any of them relate to the topics we're covering along the way, Nora will let me and Mike know, and we're going to address them live as we go. Also, we have a little something special for you today. All participants will be entered into a draw for a prize at the end of the session. So be sure to submit your name and where you're joining us from inside the chat section, no later than 10 minutes before we wrap up in order to be eligible. Now, today we have a very distinguished guest with us today. Someone who has greatly influenced the Lean and Agile communities over the last decade. Please join me in welcoming our dear friend, Mike Burrows. He is the founder of Agenda Shift, the organizer of Kanban's values modules. And to date with this event, actually, we celebrate the 10th anniversary of his seminal work, Kanban from the Inside, which was published 10 years ago in 2014. This is a great achievement and congratulations, Mike.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you for that welcome too.
Absolutely. Over the past decade, your work has evolved beyond just in the Kanban sector. Could you tell us more about that development of your later books, for example, Right to Left and Agenda Shift? What are key lessons?
Yeah. So that's like my last 10 years in 4 or 5 books. So I mean, you can see some of the clues as to where I was going, even in Kanban from the Inside. So if you haven't read it, what I did was I took the Kanban method, the principles and practices as were taught in the Kanban method, and from them I abstracted 9 values: transparency, balance, flow, customer focus, flow, leadership, understanding, agreement, and respect. And those gave me the latitude to talk about things much more broadly than just, you know, the mechanics of a Kanban board. And you know, that was part 1, those first 9 chapters. And then there was a part 2 that was all about all the other things that you should know, you know, pointers to all these other different bodies of knowledge that are important and useful to know if you're going to do, you know, great things with Kanban. And part 3 was looking at a well-practiced approach for implementing Kanban, and it starts to get you thinking about things that are outside the mechanics of the board. Gets you thinking about things like, you know, customer needs and what performance looks like from your customer perspective, and so on. But over the years, I've taken some of those things. Some of the things that people wondered, you know, well, how closely are these related to Kanban in the first place? Values like agreement, for example, and balance, and broaden those quite considerably. So agreement, if you go back to the history of the Kanban method, was about agreement on, you know, a particular way forward in how we're going to manage change. Yes. And I really dove into that agreement value big time in my next book, Agenda Shift. One thing I noticed as a trainer is, particularly doing private training, is that there'll always be people in the room who didn't know why they were there, and that really bugged me. And you know, it's not just annoying for me as a trainer, and I guess for all trainers, they're annoyed by that. But I actually started to wonder about, well, why is this, and what can we do about this? And it was clear to me that there were a lot of conversations that should be happening in organizations that actually weren't. And where that eventually took me to was thinking about, well, what kind of participation do we have in our organizations in the strategy process? How can we have better conversations? And some of you will know that I got into things like clean language and various other tools, very much about outcomes. How can we have conversations about outcomes that start with things that we know that are true, things like the bad things we experience in our organizations, our dysfunctions, our obstacles, and turn those into things that we want, and use those, several, even many obstacles that we can generate as focuses, inspirations for action. So we don't just think about, well, oh, here's a great idea, let's try this, or here's a problem, let's solve this problem. Let's think about what we really want. And let's think about how those different outcomes relate to each other. And as soon as you start to do that, what you're doing really is creating a decision framework. You are creating a strategy. And so I went beyond just how do we implement Kanban to, in more general terms, how do we have strategy conversations first around improvement? That's where I started. Broaden that to what's called inside-out strategy, improving the experience and capability of the organization. And then outside-in strategy, we start from outside the organization with our customers, our suppliers, and so on, and work inwards to the implications for us in terms of the capabilities that we need and so on. And you see there that you've gone full circle. There's a virtuous circle there. If you can look at what you're doing both inside out and outside in. That led me to my third book, Right to Left, The Digital Leader's Guide to Lean and Agile. And it's an outcome-oriented perspective on the whole of the Lean Agile landscape and beyond. So starting well within the Lean Agile landscape, what does Kanban look like when you are very, very focused on, what is it going to look like when we've made this customer impact, when we've met this need? And what does it look like when we've accounted for the learning around that? And can we make our processes more focused on getting to that impact quickly, getting to that learning quickly, not trying to push work into a process, but focusing very much on what is the next, what are the next key moments that we could be celebrating. And interestingly, that same idea works incredibly well for Scrum as well. And if you think about the way Scrum is very often described, it's described as, you start with your backlogs. And there are ceremonies that take you from one backlog to the next backlog, from your product backlog to your sprint backlog, and so on. And you keep working and working until you're ready to do a release, till you're ready to have your retrospective, and then that process starts again. That's a left to right way of looking at Scrum. Now, what instead if we worked backwards? We work backwards from the impact and the learning, where the sprint is organizing the best we can to get to that impact and learning. And then we populate that from what we're already beginning to think about in our product backlog and so on. Quite a different way actually of looking at Scrum, but it's quite a refreshing way of looking at Scrum, and it's really helpful when you start to think about scaling, where you've got more than one backlog, and end backlogs where n is proportional to the height of your safe poster, as the joke used to go. And thinking about in outcome-oriented terms is so much healthier than thinking, well, we've got this huge work breakdown structure that we need to plow through. And if that's how you're thinking about it, if that's how your PMO is thinking about it, plugging in value streams and all these other great things is going to help, but it's not going to fundamentally change things. If instead you're focusing on the impact and the learning, and that learning makes a real difference to what you're trying to do, to your strategy and so on, then things start to get a lot more exciting. So that's my third book. I actually did 2 editions of Agenda Shift, but what I normally call book 4 was a commission. What was exciting about Agenda Shift is that it got noticed. It got noticed by the academic organization development community, the OD community. And in the OD community, 2 pioneers of what's called dialogic organization development. That's organization development that's all about the internal conversation, is all about strategy conversations. It's all about maximizing the number of people that are engaged in the process, that are finding solutions, trying stuff out, and so on. They recognized what I was doing as being aligned to what they were trying to do, and they actually commissioned me to write a book. Now, how cool is that, having 2 professors that I asked me to write a book for them? Only 30,000 words, 100 pages, less than half the length of my other books. But it took me 2.5 years to write. I was really tested by them. They really pushed me. And it ended up, despite being a short book, a much deeper book, I think, than the Agenda Shift book. So that was book 4. That was published not that long ago. That was this year, early summer this year. And at the time that commission came in, I was about to start working on a very different book. So that's what I always refer to now as book 5, Wholehearted, the engaging with complexity in the deliberately adaptive organization. And it's kind of bringing all those other things together. It's how can we think about organizations about more than just flow? How can we understand how organizations really work structurally, in terms of strategy, in terms of learning, in terms of leadership, and how can they be deliberate about being adaptive? And it's not just my fancy process that I've worked out over the years. There are lots of books that do this. People design their own processes and sell those as the latest way of being adaptive. Is going back to the theory of organizations. And it's taken some great theory from the last century about how systems work, and some great theory from this century about complexity, complex adaptive systems, and so on. 2 things that people think can't be married up, but actually, if you look at it the right way, and it's this dialogue again is the way to make it work. You can do some very interesting things with it. So that's where it's taken me. I started very much in the flow world, and I've taken up, got it into much more into organizational things, strategic things, and leadership related things.
Awesome. Wow, what a journey. You absolutely caught my attention about that fifth book. When can we expect it?
One thing I should just say, I've written. I keep writing books. I love writing books, but I do this stuff. I have done real work as well, and I couldn't live off my books. I've done some significant work in the government digital space in the UK, which a few years ago was a really exciting space to be working in, and I've worked with organisations of all sorts of different kinds. But yeah, that's my career in terms of my books, or my recent career in terms of my books. Yeah.
Amazing, Mike. That is incredibly insightful. It's absolutely fascinating to see how your thinking has expanded and your experience expanded from the Kanban and Scrum themselves as methodologies to broader organizational behaviors and leaderships, which actually is kind of close to our journey because we also started as a leading Kanban platform.
Yes.
And now, we're currently addressing a full spectrum of organizational strategy, process, and project management.
I think there's quite a few people that have been on that same journey over the last 10 years. I mean, I think about the people I used to hang out with. My Kanban days, Jim Benson, Carl Scotland, for example, have been not looking at the same things as me, but they've said that same kind of broadening, and actually we're reaching some complementary conclusions. And I've done some collaborations and mashups with Carl, for example, with Philippe René and a few others. All of us have been on a journey.
Yes, absolutely. When I'm mentioning outcomes, maybe you can tell us about your outcome-oriented change and continuous transformation agenda shift book.
Yes.
There you emphasize a better way of working where teams can come together and understand how to move forward, even in challenging situations. Can you explain how outcomes-oriented approach helps such organizations with uncertainty and align in their decision making?
Yep. So let's think about how traditional change management works. I have a slightly naughty way of describing it. It's a bit of a caricature, but it's a caricature that works because we all know what it's like. We experienced it. You know how it goes. Choose a solution, sell the solution, roll the solution out, live with the consequences. And that is 1990 style change management. And I find it really shocking. I still find this shocking that 20 years of Agile, there are still a lot of people that think that that's actually the way to implement something like Agile. To implement, I don't use the word culture very often, but things that should be, should have culture impact. And what we've known for a very long time is that there are different kinds of problems. You might understand this in complexity terms, like the Cynefin framework, for example. You might understand it in terms of a spectrum. There are technical challenges where we can plan and do and be confident in the result. And for those old school methods still work. If you're rolling out a new I don't know, some new networking hardware or something like that. Perfectly fine. New email solution or whatever, perfectly fine. But where you're doing the kind of change where the thing you are trying to change is going to change under you as you're trying to do things, as even the nature of the challenge seems to change as you get to grips with it, then that sort of plan-driven, linear kind of approach to change just doesn't work. And starting with a solution is totally the wrong thing to do. So principle number one in agenda shift is outcomes before solutions. I could strengthen that. It's agreement on outcomes before solutions. Actually, agreement, one of the Kanban values, if you remember, but agreement on outcomes before solutions. We need to talk about what we want to have happen. We need to talk about what we want things to look like long before we are talking about solutions. I say long before, it doesn't actually take very long to have these conversations. Again, the shock is that organizations don't actually have these conversations. They are so quick to choosing solutions. And the first that people hear about it is when they sell the solution, try to roll the solution out. If you can instead, you can have conversations that take us to outcomes, and then we find the solutions from those outcomes. That is a game changer. Instead of pushing monolithic solutions on the organization is inspired to act in many different areas. Any one outcome can inspire multiple solution ideas. Your strategy as expressed as outcomes can generate any number of solution ideas. And then the challenge is to have the feedback loops in place that make sure that this is happening, that things are moving in the right direction, and so on. And what we do in the book is introduce some patterns that are really easy to remember. And there are some practices that go with the patterns, but you can use different practices with the same pattern and it still works. So ideal, obstacles, outcomes. Ideal, really think about what we really, really want. What would that be like? Whose needs would we be meeting? What new stories would those people be able to tell? We're not designing anything, we're just enjoying it. And that's energizing that conversation. Then we ground it in reality. What stops that? What gets in the way? And that generates obstacles. And then from those obstacles, outcomes. What would you like to happen? Then what happens? Then what happens? That's the easy version. The more elaborate versions with my clean language game 15-minute photo, for example. So there's exercises for all of these, and I've open sourced many of these exercises. But the pattern is the important thing: ideal, obstacles, outcomes. And then when we're generating solutions, meaning, measure, method. Let's make sure we really agree what it is we're trying to achieve in this area that we want solutions for. How would we measure success? And even before that, what would be the first tiniest signs that something interesting might be happening? Measures of success, goals and aspirations, and so on. Getting all of this stuff in the air, all the things we want, all the things that are in the way, all the ways we would measure progress, all of those in the air, and then generate solution ideas, and as many of them as diverse as we can make it. Those two patterns, along with some guidance on feedback, on governance, and so on. That's what keeps all this stuff moving. And you're keeping the strategy development piece and what you could call the implementation piece, but it's really a much more generative thing than that. Keeping those well connected to each other, and that's really important.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree. And you mentioned a very important point as well: obstacles. Many organizations face similar challenges adopting new ways of working. What are some of the most common challenges you've seen, and how companies can navigate them effectively?
Yes, yeah. I mean, quite often the biggest mistakes are made near the beginning. Now, I've mentioned already, that choose a solution, sell a solution pattern, and so on. But that's not the only way it can go wrong. But it is really important that in the end, that people that are going to need to change the way that they work, that they are involved, from as close to the beginning as they can possibly be.
Mm.
And I mean, even before, words like vision and things like that are used. I get a bit nervous about visionary exercises that happen before you've actually explored your problems, before you've explored your strategy and so on. They can too quickly become ways of prematurely solutionizing, or they just reflect the opinions of just a few people. I'd much rather explore the space, inquire into the space a bit more, and let things crystallize out of those conversations in terms of what we really want, what our goals are, what our most important measures of success are. Perhaps things like values come into play as well. What kind of organization are we? Are we going to be a different kind of organization at the end of this, and how will that be reflected in the kinds of decisions that we make, and so on. So make sure that you're not making those fundamental mistakes at the beginning. When people are complaining about resistance to change, they probably started in the wrong way in the first place. Now, I don't know why the change industry hasn't got that memo. I think we've known about it for a very long time, at least a couple of decades. But I think there are too many people that think overcoming resistance to change is kind of a job, or their job. And instead, I'd much rather promote participation and agreement, and give people the space in which they can innovate, and make sure that the organization is, got the right kind of feedback loops that keeps these things coherent, keeps things moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. These are all valid points. Yes, Nora, do we have a question related to the topic?
Yes, so we do have several questions. First, we do have a question from Sarabjit for something that we discussed a bit earlier. So he's asking, hi Mike, when you talk about theory of organization, what it essentially means? Are you referring to TOC, which I guess in this context would mean theory of constraint?
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Yes,
But
this is the first question.
No, that is not the theory. The theory is actually the viable system model, which emerged out of the cybernetics community in the 1970s. So it's very much from the systems community. You've got people from mathematics, from biology, neurology. All these people have studied how do organizations continue to exist? How do creatures live? How do they procreate? And go on. How do populations evolve? All these kind of questions about the world around us is changing, and it sometimes feels like a hostile place. In that situation, and that is a fact of life for many people, for many organisms, for many organizations, for many companies, and so on. What are the common things that allow organizations to keep going when things out there are hostile? How do they become adaptable enough to cope with evolving situations, changing situations? John Boyd, the OODA loop guy, put it really nicely. I'm paraphrasing here, but it's about how do we make sure that we always have options that we are capable of acting on. When you run out of options, it's game over. And if you know anything about John Boyd, he was a fighter pilot. You don't want to run out of options when you're a fighter pilot. I'm laughing, but it's serious business, obviously. But it's a serious business for organizations as well. As an organization, you don't want to run out of options. And so many organizations, they are fundamentally imbalanced. Organizations that are rushing to the next dollar and actually not laying down the foundations that they need to, and then they crumble under the weight of all their internal problems, their technical debt, for example, or the other way. And I've worked for an organization that made the opposite mistake. It was all platform, no product. Doing over investing in the fundamental stuff, but then not actually identifying what they could actually sell to people. And in a changing environment, you need to keep that balance between the doing and the thinking and the innovating and all these different things. You need to keep that balance. You need to have a good balance between the work that you're doing, how you coordinate it, and how you organize around it. I mean, those are really, really basic things. But if those three things don't work well together, you don't know where you are, for example. Or it seems like your coordinating systems are a big overhead on doing the work, and people will complain against that and push back against it and perhaps not use it. Getting those three things working really well together is really crucial, and it's not surprising that a lot of improvement methods focus on those things. But getting that working well with the strategy process is also really important. And if you're in a changing environment, and when you don't 100% understand customer needs, and or those customer needs are going to change over time, which they will, you need a strategy process and a delivery process that are very closely tied together and that are in balance with each other, so one doesn't get carried away and leave the other one behind. There's also another question, another really fundamental constraint. Oh, by the way, everything I've just said applies at every scale of the organization. You know, a team that strategizes together stays together, you could say, but you know, and they deliver clearly. But the organization as a whole does its strategizing, it does its delivery, and you know, at every scale that you look at, you can see that these fundamental things are happening. There's also a fundamental constraint that is really serious that affects organizations. You have finite capacity for decision making and for communication. And that's why how you organize is so important. And because things don't happen instantaneously, news doesn't travel instantaneously, you have to trust that other people are doing their thing to the best of their knowledge and to the best of their ability while you get on and do your thing. But if you misunderstand each other, if peer teams, for example, misunderstand each other, then their work won't come together well. If between the doing and the thinking there is misunderstanding, then you might, for example, be planning something that you're incapable of delivering for reasons of capability or capacity, or based on a misunderstanding of what's needed out there. And it's actually the people closest to the customer are the ones that know what the customer really needs. Or you might have the delivery part not properly understanding what the strategy is. And again, you're going to make some bad decisions. So it's really important that these different aspects of the organization are in balance. So that was value number 2 in Kanban, and it's the big theme of book 5. What are these different aspects of the organization? How do you recognize when they're out of balance with each other? And that's something that the systems people have understood for a very long time. But then how can you present that in a way that is actually compatible with the idea of a complex adaptive system, where there is no one model of the organization that everyone can agree on, where everyone's experience of the organization is different, where we want the innovation to be happening like everywhere, and you can't model that and plan all of that and so on. So how do you get what to many people feel like incompatible things? How do you get those to work together? It's quite an ambitious book in that way. You know, I'm entering a bit of a minefield politically, you could say.
Yes.
I'm very excited about this book, and yeah, it kind of brings all the last 4 books together. Yeah.
Amazing. I can see that actually there is a follow-up question.
Yep.
Constraints in organization keep dancing. How would you associate it in microservices world and define what you measure against what, any, why?
Yeah, I'm not sure I capture the whole of that question. Constraints are important, and theory of constraints is is interesting and important, but in the complexity world, we use the word constraint a lot more broadly than the theory of constraints community does. In my book, a constraint is anything that affects anything's behavior. And that's really broad, and it's not necessarily bad either. Anything that affects anything else's behavior. Just your proximity to another person affects your behavior. Having a goal affects your behavior. Whether you had breakfast or not in the morning, you know, affects your behavior. I mean, I'm, you know, being silly now, but you know, there are lots of things, most of which, or many of which, certainly we can't control, that affect the behavior of individuals, affect the behavior of groups, affect the behavior and the performance of the organization overall. And actually getting to what those are and doing something about them. Yes, there is some resonance with theory of constraints there, but we come at this not very differently from a balance point of view and from a complexity point of view in book 5. If you coming at this with a theory of constraints, you know, with that in your mind, you actually will have to unlearn how to read the word constraint as you're reading the book, which is difficult. If you're coming at this thinking every diagram describes a flow diagram, you've got to unlearn that as well. It's about relationships. It's about balance. So it's quite a different approach to most of what you will read in you know, about adaptive organizations and agile. It's not really an agile book, but it obviously mentions agile. Yeah, it's the challenge is to realize that we are really coming at things from a very different direction. But that's great because we've got something that's complementary to the flow stuff. And when the flow stuff isn't doing enough for us, we've got other things that we can try.
Absolutely agree. There is a question on what's the title of the book?
I mentioned it very quickly in passing. That you weren't. It's called Wholehearted: Engaging with Complexity in the Deliberately Adaptive Organization. Just to break that down a bit, so wholehearted is a reference to a Christopher Alexander quote. So Christopher Alexander, he's the patterns guy, the architect. I wrote a blog post in, I think, 2018 while I was writing Right to Left. And the Agenda Shift community got very excited about this wholehearted thing, and we were exploring what it might mean. We had a curry in London where I think 16 of us met for a curry in London, exploring this wholehearted thing. It became like our byword, the title of our mission statement. And I've developed that, and I'm working what a wholehearted organization might mean. I've developed a nice little leadership model: engage, invite, celebrate. We need leaders engaging on the right challenges. We need them to be inviting people into the process. We need them to be celebrating the innovations that their colleagues are making. And if you think about it, if any one of those things is missing, there is something seriously wrong in leadership terms. So it's a nice little leadership model inspired by the book. And the book, using the models that I talked about, is helping you find the dysfunctions in your organization, the imbalances, the things that you might want to change, things that you might want to invite other people into doing something about, and using some of the tools developed in Agenda Shift and organizing conversations to explore them, inquire into them. And then obviously, if we're going to change anything, we've actually got to do something. We've got to act. We've got to try. You've got to intervene. We've got to try a solution, whatever language you want to use, and feed that back, as learning. So yeah, some stuff that you'll recognise from my other books, but stuff that is actually very, very different perspective for most people coming from Agile as well. So that's that makes it, you'll recognise enough to help you make sense of the stuff that's new. So it'll stretch people, but in a good way, I hope.
So thank you, Mike. We're going to send the name of the book in our follow-up emails after the event, so no worries about that.
Yep.
With Mike, before this webinar, we agreed to put the Q&A into the highlight of the webinar. Mike, there are a few questions piled up. Are you fine going with the live Q&A from now on?
I'm completely fine. You can ask your questions. You can take audience questions. Yeah, as I said, the harder the better.
Yeah. Okay, we'll go with that and these questions. They are the important ones. So yeah, Nora, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm starting with a question from Leo. Hi, Leo. So he's asking, how relevant do you think it is to differentiate between short-term outcome output and long-term outcome?
Yeah, they are important. it's a catchphrase I've had in Agenda Shift from the very early days. It's outcomes all the way down. You know, if you're familiar with solutions focus, you kind of that same sort of idea there. You know, in solutions focus, you might ask the miracle question where everything's changed, and it's just amazing. You know, but at the same time, you're looking for those smallest, tiniest signs, because it's those smallest, tiniest signs, maybe of things that maybe are already happening. And perhaps all we need to do is to amplify or transplant what is already working to make things better for more people. And if you also think about some of these, you know, smaller outcomes, those can each be a trigger for a solution idea. And you know, when you're doing something, you know, that's complex, when it's adaptive, you can have goals, but you're gonna have to do lots and lots of different things before you can fully say that you've achieved that goal. And identifying, you know, what are your opportunities, and where will they take you, and thinking about the relationships of between outcomes, not because, you know, it's guaranteed that if you do this one thing it will give you the other, but to have some semblance of coherence. So we are all sort of pulling in the same kind of direction, still trying to maximize, you know, the number of people that are trying different things. You know, that this sort of maximizing the involvement in change, not just in making decisions, but actually doing different things around the organization. That's called generative change, or as a hallmark of generative change. And you know, that this is how I got you know, invited to write that fourth book, because there was enough of that in Agenda Shift to make that connection. So yeah, outcomes at different levels of scale. The first tiny signs that something interesting might be happening. First meaningful measures of progress. Measure success, signs that you're winning, signs that you have won. So one lags the other. Goals and aspirations. You know, your goals, your aspirations, you're not necessarily going to achieve, but that all helps to set some kind of direction. And you know whether your ideas are going to take you in that direction or in a different direction. And if it's going to take you in a different direction, then there probably needs to be a conversation about that.
All right, thank you very much, Mike. So on the same topic, I'm going on with a question from Joao, and he is saying outcomes before solution. With regards to this topic, in your experience, which industries do tend to have the highest variation on strategic outcomes on short 1 to 3 years and mid-term 3 to 5 years? For example, healthcare does have a high variation. AI is increasingly heterogeneous as well, with complexities over many different disciplines as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I can give a general answer. It's not something I've really studied, but you know, that in general, if you're going to have significant amounts of capital investment, then you're going to be managing things over longer time frames. In the software world, you know, I have a personal bias. I always try to avoid projects that were more than 9 months long. I really want to see instant feedback. I want instant gratification. I don't have the patience for those longer term projects. There is a time and a place for longer term projects, but the ones that are going to generate the learning most quickly are obviously the ones that are more either shorter and or more iterative. So those are tending to manage to rather shorter time frames. I don't know if that was quite the answer that you were looking for. But I had one thing from my time. I spent some very happy times in the UK government digital space. I can't remember if I mentioned that already. We did aim to get, you know, something live really quickly, and that taught us a lot. And actually getting to live actually massively improves things from an engineering point of view. I mean, you know, if anyone who's done anything with continuous deployment, continuous integration, you know, various things we associate with DevOps now. But the faster you get those things in place, the easier things are. And I remember my colleagues, when on one of my was delivery manager on 2 of the UK government's what are called exemplar projects when they were trying this new way of doing things for the first time. And I told my colleagues, and they were quite nervous about going live. And I said, don't worry, it'll be great. And things will be so much better when it's live. And my colleagues just didn't believe me. You know, they just couldn't believe that, you know, well, we're going to be supporting this thing as well as trying to build it. But it really focused you on having a pipeline that worked. And you get instant feedback on anything that you deploy. And you know, once you get into the groove of that, it's such a much better way of working. And if governments can do it, most other industries can do it. You know, that's a really great message of that. So I personally tend to work to shorter timeframes, but I do understand that there is a need sometimes to invest real capital, and when there is, inevitably you have to work to longer timeframes.
Absolutely. Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions. As I mentioned, there are a lot of them in the chat. We can take them offline, get back to you via email, so no worries. But we can, yes, continue with 2 more, maybe, Nora?
Yes, that would be good. So I'm going to continue with a question from Rodrigo. He's asking, how is your process or way to work in a team-driven department company to understand the value stream and make the changes to an outcome-oriented agility?
Yes, so I'm perhaps once removed from things like value stream mapping and so on. But if you go back to my Kanban stuff, you know, my advice, and right to left as well, it's in the clues in the title. You know, my advice always is to work backwards from customer impact. You know, what is the next customer impact that we want to make? What is the work that's closest to getting there? What is the work that's behind that? And what's the work that's behind that in the queue, and so on, working backwards through the process. And that's a really good way of not just understanding the process that you have, but of managing it as well. If you start from the right and work backwards, you become much more focused on the learning and the impact, as I talked about. Also, you know, more focused on completion, and you're not spending too much time at the beginning of the process wondering about what would we be starting next. If you haven't got the capacity to start new stuff, why are you talking about this stuff that's in the backlog? You don't need, you just don't need to. All that stuff that can be happening in the background so that you're ready at the right kind of time. So just that change of orientation from right to left, from impact and learning first, and reviewing things closest to completion first. Just that one change of perspective and that change of practice is really, really important. Starting always with your backlogs and working things through the process, you tend to push. You tend to start more work than really you've got the capacity for. You know, that's a recipe for being overburdened and overcommitted. So overburdened, you know, all classic problems, your context switching, multitasking, delays, quality problems, all that kind of stuff. And that is horrible. That is horrible for the individual people doing the work. Overcommitted is a different problem, but it's almost as bad or just as bad. You can't make a new commitment without breaking an existing one. And you can't be an adaptive organization if you can't make commitments. I mean, you know, if you can't, if not, you know, if you're not in a position that you effectively, you have run out of options. As I said earlier, that's a really bad place to be. So not overcommitting, not overburdening, starting from the right and working backwards is really important. You know, we knew that in the Kanban days, and you'll see that message in the Kanban book, in Kanban from the Inside. You'll see that message time and time again in Right to Left. That's really the premise of the book, but it broadens that idea as well, and you'll see it come back in Wholehearted as well in book 5. You'll see it there too.
So I know that we haven't yet covered the leadership behaviors topic, but there is one question related to the leadership. What would you do to get leadership buy-in?
Leadership buy-in. Well, again, it's, you can't beat participation. You can't beat having a conversation. And I am and I aren't trying to sell an approach. I'm not trying to sell a particular organization design, a particular process design, and so on. You could say that all I'm asking is it will take 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days having some conversations, inquiring into what we actually want to achieve together. I don't think that's too much to ask. You know, a 5-minute conversation before making a big investment, a 5-minute conversation before issuing a policy change that's going to impact, you know, many, many people, and so on and so on and so on. And I think part of, you know, something else I've said elsewhere, you know, you can't separate leadership development, organizational development, and delivery. They've got to be tied together. And you've got to be trying to achieve something for the business as you explore what your strategy for that, you know, was and is going to be. And if you are helping leaders do better at those conversations, you are developing them as leaders. You are helping them to engage, to invite, to celebrate, and so on. I don't know if that answers the question sufficiently. If there's a follow-up question there, I'd be glad to answer it if there is still the time.
Yes, no, there is no follow-up question, but Vincent, if you would like.
So yeah, as I keep saying, I think, you know, don't think of it in terms of overcoming resistance to change. If you're thinking that if you think your job is to sell, I think you're possibly going about it the wrong way. To explore, to inquire, to be curious, to have conversations, to find agreement, you know, that is a different kind of proposition. But for that to be authentic, you can't go in knowing what the answers are already. Now that for some people is going to be a challenge, but I'm going to, perhaps we should finish on that bombshell.
Okay.
You know, you'll have some better and more interesting conversations if you can do that authentically.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. Vincent is thinking he would like to explore, so no follow-up questions on that. We have questions on flow behavior. It's quite a long one, but maybe we can close with it. It's from Joao again. He says, I remember having a keynote once with a mathematician that was understanding the flow as non-reductionist and monodirectional, left to right or right to left.
Yep.
But rather on different levels, even going backwards and the coming back to the same stage and then moving, where it was suggested to use Markov models. Those mixes complexity and TOC, but even more within different topographies. Depending on the dependencies and to make it even funnier, adding filtering and sorting of perspectives from value, time, or efficiency. Based on this, in your experience, what are your thoughts on this perspective, using Markov models to see flow?
I think there are people doing good work exploring the mathematics of flow. And, you know, I actually studied a bit of queuing theory myself. You know, I actually have a background in mathematics. You know, I understand the mathematics here. But also we have to operate in the real world as well. And it's actually good to have theory that supports the practice, but you know, when your understanding of the theory is contradicting, you know, what you're actually seeing, then I would go with what you're actually seeing. And in any case, most of the theory points to the same kind of things. You know, you've got to be very careful not to overburden your system. You've got to be very careful to manage your dependencies. Where we need to be careful is that you know, there are domains where the maths has been very, very well studied. I mean, obviously on things like production lines, it's been very well studied. In queuing theory originated from telecommunications. You know, how do telephone exchanges perform? That's where queuing theory started. There's a lot of maths that describes how produce moves through shops. You know, how much buffer should we keep for each kind of line item in our shop, for example? And there are literally formulas that you can apply to do that. You know, and with lots of good maths to support it. The problem we have in knowledge work is that our work items aren't the same. They're not heterogeneous. They are full of unknowns. Work that we think that might take an hour takes a day or a week, or vice versa sometimes. And I personally get more value from getting better at recognizing which kind of bit of work it is, having better conversations about those kinds of works than I do from doing the maths. The general sense of the maths guides me in a good direction. But when you consider that there's, you know, think about the 80-20 rule, you know, only a small proportion of your work items are going to deliver 80% of your value. Or 90% of your value. I mean, the range in value of work items can be absolutely enormous. So to manage your portfolio of work, your backlog of work, your queues of work, as though everything was the same, is nonsensical. But don't do anything where the maths clearly tells you that to do it would be stupid. I mean, as I said, don't get overburdened. Do manage your dependencies. But you know, this work is real. It has real customers. Your colleagues are real people with real different kinds of expertise and so on. And all of that is just as important as the mechanics of a coordination system. And how you are organized around those pieces of work is also important as well. And as I said before, the doing of the work, the coordinating of it, and the organization around it, you know, those need to work well together, or you'll never know where you are. So yeah, the maths is helpful. Just to summarize that, the maths is helpful, but there are bigger questions around it, and in the knowledge work environment, those bigger questions often dominate.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I hope this helps Joao and answers his question. Actually, we still have time. Let us see what the Q&A has. Okay, so we have a question from Alexandra. So she's asking, working with different organizations, what did you have success with when helping with change in a sales-driven organization?
I'll be honest, I haven't done a lot with sales, but I did have one very interesting experience doing Kanban training. This is going back, you know, 10 years. And I had the entire leadership. There's a theory of constraints aspect to this as well. I had the entire leadership team of the organization in my training. So the theory of constraints bit first, and when I got to the bit that, you know, somewhere in the organization there is the ultimate bottleneck. There was a moment when everybody looked at each other and they suddenly realized it had to be that one of them represented that bottleneck. And it wasn't in technology, interestingly, it was in finance. And that was quite an interesting, powerful moment, actually. So, you know, I credit to theory of constraints for that moment. What was also funny about that training is that the least interested person was the person from sales. But when I came back to the organization 2 weeks later, he grabbed me to show me his Kanban board that he had above his desk. Yeah, it goes back to that previous question. In the end, there's nothing like doing it for real. And you know, he made it work for him, and in the end, he was a happy customer. But I can't say I've done a lot with sales other than that. You know, I think I would speak to someone who genuinely has.
Okay, thank you. And maybe if one very quick one for 2 minutes from Richard. What measures of success work well for buyers and suppliers commercially when trying to frame a contract around achieving outcomes, especially if the buyer is used to accepting the delivery of outputs or solutions instead?
Yeah, I mean, it's that is a difficult one. And again, I would say I'm not the world's top expert on contracting.
Okay.
I think the principles is that you want to frame a contract that is iterative and shares the risk and reward appropriately. And it's not the end of the world if one party or the other decides to walk away. And if you do it with that in mind and focus on those early wins, on the early impact, on that early learning, and so on, you can work it out going forward. I'm not minimizing the challenge of actually turning that into a legal document. But you've got to understand, and your client's got to understand, how much it costs to fund a team, and they've got to understand that there is a cost to growing or shrinking that team. There is a cost to delaying providing necessary inputs to that team, and so on. So that becomes very much a flow problem. But in terms of the governance, you want a governance structure that well represents both sides, well represents all sides, and is showing clear signs of progress from the very earliest possible moment. I personally, wouldn't purchase something where I wasn't going to see something for my money, for months or years down the line. I just wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't advise any of my clients to do it either. And if you can find a way to take the risk out of the project at the earliest opportunity, and it's fair to both sides, then if it doesn't work out, then in the end, no one's been insulted by it. It's just that was the learning, and we will learn from it, and maybe that relationship will continue in a different way, or perhaps it won't. But if the risk has been shared equitably, then that should be fine.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mike, for the discussion today. It's been a real pleasure, my friend, and I'm sure the audience has gained a lot of valuable insights. Congratulations again on the anniversary of your book, Kanban from the Inside. And now, as promised, it's time to see who will get the special gift provided by Mike.
Yes, so thank you all very much for participating, for your questions, and for leaving your names and LinkedIn's in the chat. So I have posted just right now in the chat the page where you can see all the published books of Mike. And today we're going to draw the winner who is going to win by his choice one of the published books of Mike Burrows. So I'm going to share the screen now, and we're going to see who is the winner. Okay. All right, so I'm going to turn the wheel now. Okay, that's Stuart Gibbons.
Yes, here we are.
Yes. Congratulations. So we're going to follow up with you after this webinar to arrange this, and congratulations once again.
Congratulations to the winner. Yes, we'll reach out to you to arrange the delivery of the prize. Thank you for everyone who has joined today. As a special bonus due to the partnership with Agenda Shift, you also receive an extended trial with Businessmap. We'll send you the recording along with these details over email. We hope you enjoyed this session as much as we did. Stay tuned for more exciting webinars, and until then, take care.